right. Hello, hello. Saw like half of you on the way over. Walk together. Guys doing okay? Surviving? We'll see next week how it goes. Getting there. Well, the good news is time does pass, and so whatever happens, time will pass, and then you'll be on the other side of it. Such a simple little concept, but it is true. And you'll be done even with college pretty soon, right? Which may be as wonderful or a scary thing or whatever, you know. Okay. Well, today we'll mostly talk about, partly about aerated septic systems and partly about artificial wetlands as treatment options for wastewater. So that's the topic today. Though I have been, it's been good to hear about the different projects you guys are getting going. So maybe after when you return, we'll have you share a little bit more about that. Had some family in town this weekend, so I still have not touched the grading that I owe you, but I will be doing that this week. Not that I think you'll be writing for those of you who are on the senior design trip, excuse me, but you'll have it very soon, and then you'll then have that feedback. Yeah.
In Google, it still says, it still says Friday is the due date.
We're gonna move that. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
I just wanted to confirm.
Yeah.
That is
That's not the due date. That doesn't work. I can't get you the feedback, and you can't do. Yeah. So ignore the Moodle for now. I will update that, and we'll rearrange. Okay. All right. Any other issues, questions? Okay. So last time we talked about septic systems, we kind of covered the basics, a bit about the design. Primarily, we need the tank itself to remove solids and digest the solids so we don't accumulate solids too quickly. And fortunately, bacteria can do that pretty well. And the types of bacteria and the types of chemistry that happens in the anaerobic setting works pretty well to do just that. Most of that is to protect the drain field so that as we send the liquid out, we have a way for it to disperse without clogging up all the little pores in the soil. And any other constraints physically, we are trying to just simply avoid things like roots growing into that. We'd also make sure that erosion doesn't kind of cut through and expose the field directly, so then you're getting surface runoff or anything like that. There are a couple of exceptions, and this is something kind of interesting. Didn't put any slides here, but one thing you can do if you have soil that doesn't really drain too well, one option is to actually elevate everything a bit and then make a mound of dirt over your system and just pile it on top, cut down deep, maybe a foot or two, and layer that with gravel and sand. More porous, gives you more surface area for your liquid to discharge into the soil. So even if you have a high water table or poorly percolating soil, you can kind of maybe get away with that if you expand it enough. Of course, if you get enough surface area, even very slow percolation can work, right? Even through clay, if you have just tons and tons of surface area, which is very costly, you can make it happen. So there are ways you could always force it to happen, but oftentimes it's not quite economical. So that's one option, and that's something that we were actually recommending to the group in Nicaragua, that perhaps making a bed over the septic field, raising the bathrooms a little bit, might help with some of these cases where the groundwater is too high during the wet season. So that might be a thing. For an alternate, might be an aerated system. Now, this is not often going to be economical, as we'll see, for resource scarce settings, because we need electricity pretty much constantly. We need the education for maintenance, and this is even an issue in Louisiana, because essentially for these on-site systems, the way we operate them in the States is it's up to the homeowner to run this tiny little wastewater treatment plant. So that means if we can put it in the ground and ignore it, great. And ultimately, eventually there's probably going to be a problem and then you stop ignoring it. But hopefully you just do preventive maintenance every 5 years or something and it can operate. So the aerated treatment units require a little more on that. And by the way, I was preparing some of these materials. I found a manual from the EPA in 2002 on-site wastewater treatment systems. So I haven't posted this to Moodle yet. You could find it online. I will post it to Moodle, I expect. But it's quite a large manual, and it does talk about all sorts of systems, including they'll call these aerobic, so aerated aerobic treatment units, ATUs, as well as conventional septic and other processes. So if you're interested or need some more information than we cover here, definitely take a look here. I've grabbed some information for today from that manual and a fair bit from our book, is kind of where some of the information is coming from. Okay, so if instead of the septic field and septic tank and all of that, if instead we use an aerated system, it might look something like this, where we have an aerator. So we have an air pump to take air from outside, pump it in, and we've got all the bubbles coming up and probably pumping and adding in air in a couple spots. That'll be causing a lot of mixing. And last time we talked about how mixing was one way to get the sludge to digest better. You get no pockets built up that could be degraded, but the bacteria don't have access or whatever. So that kind of helps reduce the amount of sludge that will accumulate. Even though we're aerobic and that is not quite as efficient, it still does a pretty good job preventing that. We will get scum on the surface, undoubtedly, especially with all the bubbles, but we could put in this baffle here to kind of stop that from approaching the effluent. So the entire scheme here will be, we have wastewater discharging in, we've got aeration in a fair portion of this little tank, and then we have a space where we can have sedimentation. And you see, in this case, it's a little bit like an upflow sedimentation chamber where water is going to flow kind of upwards. Some of it will make its way out, but in that process, there will be sedimentation along the way. So the water will slowly then make its way and drain through here and be discharged from there. So that's kind of the scheme of it. We'll take a look at another reactor scheme, but this one's pretty typical of what we would see in Louisiana, this design there. So we'll notice is we've got gravity doing that particle sedimentation again for us. We've got aeration to promote the biological growth, and the biology is really what's driving the waste consumption and transformation. Ultimately, we'll get solids and we'll have to pump those. And if you were to flush, let's say, a Q-tip, right? If you start thinking about accidentally flushed a Q-tip down the toilet, where does that go? What happens to it? Well, it's going to end up on the bottom of this and sit there until it's cleaned out, right? So do that too many times, flush too much stuff that's not going to degrade, well, you will eventually have a problem. So typically these have some sort of access point, access riser here. You could get in and kind of suction pump things out. So that's, and that's also true for typical septic tanks as well. Then when you send it out for discharge, some systems will have disinfection. Hopefully they would have disinfection, but not all. And that's a little bit kind of a local jurisdiction issue. Sometimes they'll be sprayed with a sprinkler onto lawns. So they'll even try to call this a zero liquid discharge, meaning that they were just watering lawns with it instead of having it discharge from a pipe. That's not actually zero liquid discharge. That's a misnomer. They're lying. But there's certain regulations that people try to sidestep by making that claim. It's clearly not. And then if you stop and think about it for a moment, if you have a sprinkler system and you're not disinfecting, there's some serious concerns about spraying pathogens everywhere, right? Aerosolizing them. In fact, I learned about that first from a friend of mine living in Mississippi was telling me, like, he has one of these systems in his house, and he can tell when his neighbors are not chlorinating or run out of chlorine or whatever because the smell. So that by the way, that probably also means their aerator is not functioning particularly well, as Evan probably knows. If the aerator is not functioning all the way, it's not getting enough air. I've seen cases where you have this little air pocket we'll see, or air vent system. We'll see a couple of photos. If you end up getting, like, let's say an ant hill growing around it, it could just block the air influent, incoming air, and then you're not getting any air into the tank. And it sounds like it's running, the motor's humming along, but you're not getting the treatment. It becomes similar to a septic treatment, maybe with a tiny bit of air, and that's going to be gross when it comes out. It's going to be stinky, all of that. So that's just not a good system when it's malfunctioning. So there's a lot of things that could block the air pump. These pumps sometimes will also fail. The way the pumps work, they can still be pumping, but the diaphragm breaks or degrades or something. And so it's moving, but it's not moving any air. That could happen too. So you're not actually pumping your air in. So there's several issues with this. The manual back in 2002 recommended some sort of noise alarm that goes off as soon as the aerator stops or the water level reaches too high or something like that indicates a malfunction in the system that would alert the homeowner that they need to get it maintenance. Now, I don't know, I haven't heard anything of that happening in Louisiana, but again, that's all up to whoever's making these systems and whatever guidelines a state or local jurisdiction is implementing to have them. Now, Louisiana has a rule that these units must have the capacity to disinfect, let's say with chlorine or something, but there's no enforcement that they do disinfect unless it's at a business level. So those have some different limitations. So the businesses, small businesses and things that have these systems, they should be disinfecting and they should have some regulations and enforcement there. But the homeowner scale, not necessarily. And so you'll see a pretty common, got a picture of Eben over here. Here's a ATU discharging into a little ditch here. That's actually a pretty common way it would be happening, is just discharging straight into a ditch by the property or the edge of the property. Now, one thing I'll note is, this is actually at the home of a wastewater operator. So he's got his system working really well and all that, and so it's good stuff. But he doesn't chlorinate because he knows as soon as he does, it kills all of the fish and everything in that little, like, there are actually living organisms there, including mosquito fish. As long as he's keeping his wastewater thing running well, it's supportive of natural life there because it's been aerated and all of that. So there's probably some pathogen issues, but if you start chlorinating, it's also killing all those things. And then you have things like mosquito issues or just like a dead zone, and that has its own problems. So it kind of makes sense at the end of the day why in that particular scenario there's not chlorine. Now, if you're spraying it on the yard, I think that chlorine is not going to hurt the yard and would be a great idea before you're spraying that everywhere, in my opinion. But you can just see as I tell you a little bit about this, there's some challenges here, even for well-educated people or a well-educated population. And there's a lot of issues and a lot of need for more education specifically about wastewater. You all probably had no idea about these. There's a couple of you that probably have one of these growing up in your home system. I never even knew about the ATUs, even with all my education, until I was here and working on some projects here. So it's not widely known, but the expectation is each individual homeowner is an operator now, right? So that's a strange challenge. And if we start thinking about that, it's a similar challenge to doing anything water sanitation on a decentralized scale, right? Because that's what this is decentralized treatment. Okay, another possible arrangement. I think this was a company in Australia. They have systems like this where we see the influent coming from the house here on the left, coming in, and we can see, they're showing a sludge layer forming. Got wastewater coming into here. You'll have some scum on the top. So then it essentially it gives some sedimentation here for the large or the quickly settling stuff flowing through this baffle. And none of this is aerated here. So this might actually end up having somewhat of an anaerobic zone here. I'm not sure if that's by design or if that's that would really be true. I would kind of expect it would go anaerobic here though. And then goes through a baffle and overtops this second baffle. And then you get into an aerated system. And then after that, you let sedimentation occur, and from there you'll get it out and pump it out to where you're going to apply it to land. Now, and then here you would have some sludge return to kind of keep the sludge mixing with, in this area to move it back to that first spot where there's probably more space, and that would be where you would remove your sludge or pump it out later. So in this scheme, I think that it's fairly interesting, and maybe this is for slightly larger scale things because we have these other pumps involved. I would think that this part towards the back could go anaerobic a bit, but at least right here, this is their disinfection chamber. So here they're disinfecting. That's going to kill off the microbes, and that'll kind of stop your oxygen demand, or your it'll stop the demand of oxygen because the bacteria are dying. So then you pump it out from there. So another setup, the whole scheme here you see is we have some sort of sedimentation because one of our objectives is to not discharge wastewater solids into the environment. And in this case, it's not as important to get the fine stuff for like a septic drain field, but we still have regulations we're trying to meet in terms of total suspended solids, right? That's part of the deal. Okay, so some typical parameters. Here's from the manual. In the States, we would expect these things to treat anywhere from 400 to 1,500 gallons per day. That's a fair bit of water. So that's a good amount, and probably a lot more than we'd expect from, let's say, a home in Nicaragua. I was actually just on a call this morning talking about with Caroline and Scott. For those of you who joined us, Scott Lutic did his career at Geosyntec, was recently retired and was doing some volunteer work down there as well. And we were talking about the flow demands for different wells that have been drilled, and they weren't necessarily able to extract enough water. And so what to do about that, how much water was being extracted, and it was a good conversation. And one of the things I learned or was reminded of is it's like, well, in the wet season, they probably don't need as much water because they have plenty of water to water their plants and stuff. But I was reminded that, well, given these fancy water systems, everybody has a meter, so they're paying for their water, so they actually don't typically use their expensive water for anything but drinking and hygiene kind of stuff, and cooking. So they often will have a private well that's dirty that they're going to use for keeping their lawn watered or things like that. So all that to say is these numbers seem quite large compared to what we would expect in a kind of more resource scarce setting where water and everything is more expensive and all that. Okay. So the typical organic loading that's coming into a system like this would be somewhere between 100 to 300 milligrams per liter. And this is just total organics you could measure this by total organic carbon would be one way to get a similar estimate. That's probably what they're referencing here. So that's quite a lot of organic matter. That would be coming from not just our toilet flushes, but also whatever we're doing with dishwashing, and laundry. All of that is adding a bunch of organic matter to the system. The goal and the kind of the target performance of an aerated system like this would be to bring that down to about 25 milligrams per liter of carbonaceous biological oxygen demand, the BOD5 measurement. So 5-day biological demand, oxygen demand, coming from the carbon. And 25 is still a fair bit. So if we compare that to wastewater discharges in other places, this is probably over the limit of a fair number of municipal discharges. It kind of depends on the receiving water. Sometimes you'll have two limits. One, you might say it must be like 90 or 95% reduced, and it has to be below 10 milligrams per liter, something like that. If you had a stream that was entirely made up of this type of water, well, at most, your saturation of oxygen in water is going to be around 8 milligrams per liter. So with no air exchange, that would go anoxic very quickly a couple times over, right? With some air exchange or some time to let that happen, maybe it's okay. And perhaps the easily degradable stuff has already been removed for the most part. So maybe it's going to be a little slower on the removal. So in general, it probably won't cause everything to go completely stagnant or eutrophic, oxygen deprived. So, and again, if you're going to spray that on a lawn, that's probably totally fine in that sense. Okay, total suspended solids. Again, you have somewhere between 100 and 350 milligrams per liter of total solids, and these are supposed to remove so that you have less than 30 milligrams per liter. Now, these may vary based on, again, jurisdiction and things. Eben, do you know what the design for the systems here? Do you remember Ronnie talking about their parameters exactly? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then this solids seems pretty familiar to me too. I just wasn't sure if it was the same number there. Yeah. And one of the things about these flow rates, by the way, is because we were kind of scheming a design, this would usually be all happening in about 6 hours. So you don't really have much of a flow rate at 3 in the morning, typically. Maybe an occasional flush, somebody gets up to go to the bathroom, right? But in general, your flow rate is very low for a lot of the day. Maybe everybody goes to school or work or whatever. And then in the morning and evening for showers and laundry, maybe weekends. Some people do all their laundry on the weekends, so you have 1,500 gallons per day on Saturdays and 300 on other days. It can be quite variable. So these are the general designs then. Fecal coliforms, they're going to be there, obviously. Typically, in the effluent, you'll have something like 3 to 4 logs, so 1,000 to 10,000 bacteria per 100 milliliters. So that's just a typical value. So for disinfection, if you can reduce that by 2 to 3 logs, you're doing pretty good in making that a lot cleaner. So that's kind of shows why you need the disinfection. You will tend to have a small reduction in pathogenic organisms just simply because the other types of organisms are growing. The pathogens will eventually decay. Maybe things will prey on them, but you're not relying on this in any way or expecting it to really do anything major for you in that sense. Okay, in terms of maintenance, already talked about it a bit, but that aerator has to be working for the system to be doing anything good. And that's a big potential challenge. So when we thought about, what to do in Nicaragua when the septic isn't going to work, I was just sort of learning about this too. And I was like, well, maybe, but also probably maybe not, because the power requirements for the aerator, the infrastructure cost for all of this. I think in that 2002 manual, there was a price estimate for one of these aerated treatment units, something like between $7,000 and $9,000, something like that. I didn't check the price estimations for the septic system, and the way they do the septic in Nicaragua would be fairly cheap, but even still, I think that's $1,000, $1,500, something like that. So it would not be, this would not be cheap, and an aerator, replacing an aerator every 3 to 5 years is probably expected. That's not cheap. Solid buildup happens a little quicker than septic, so you're looking at 3 to 5 years for that as well in terms of typical pump out times, or it may be expected. Perhaps that would be different in cases with low flow and things like that. So a lot of things to consider here, and again, that disinfection, part of the whole point in doing anything with a decentralized system, especially in kind of the developing country context, is to try to reduce the exposure to pathogens, right? To mitigate that fecal-oral route of transmission. And if you're not disinfecting, then this is, helpful in some ways, but still a pretty significant problem. Okay, this is what a typical aerator might look like, where we have, and this just happens to be sitting on a cinder block, but this is the aerator. It's probably a smart idea to elevate it off the floor with all the leaves and things a bit. But we've got an electrical box powering this aerator. This is slightly removed from the home here, and I think this might be the vent, and there's a access port somewhere right nearby, or maybe that's this. I think there's a bigger one next to it. So we see the air be just injected straight into the tank that's below ground. You can't really see it, but it's down there, and it would look, like one of these tanks sitting in the ground. A couple of discharges here. We can see what it looks like. In the left, the bigger picture is this is operating probably okay. This is there's two that we've been sampling, and this is the dirtier of the two, both of these shots. On the left, we can see the color of the water is kind of brownish, looks kind of like a river or a stream or something in that sense. So it has a fair amount of particles. You can kind of see this one tended to have a lot, what we've seen so far. So it's got some turbidity, but it looks like it has at least been received that treatment. On the right, there was a time where it seems like the system was failing. Perhaps the aerator was no longer functioning, and you can see this kind of milky color. That's probably very likely had it's gone anoxic, and so now it's got other bacterial processes happening, and this is that sort of that putrefying, how we might call it, putrid, something like that, and that's giving it this milky color. It's just not receiving the treatment properly. Also might be the case that because we don't have that biological activity happening in the typical manner, perhaps some of the soaps or surfactants aren't getting processed as well and are maybe contributing to the color there as well. So definitely sometimes the treatment turns out to be not so good. And again, that should all just be up to the aerator right there. So as we think about how to fix a challenge like that, or what to do about it, what we've been working on primarily is the disinfection side. Okay, how can we get some sort of disinfection system? That's our research part of this project. But that really doesn't do anything if that's the way the water is. I mean, it probably still helpful, but there's still major issues because now this water certainly has way too much BOD in it and will cause a problem to whatever stream it's contributing to. One of the current issues in Louisiana in general is the fact that these types of discharges are in a lot of places, and there are EPA requirements for how our rivers and streams are doing relate to wastewater discharges. So we have things called total maximum daily load limits. So TMDLs are designed to say, okay, we can only have this amount of wastewater being added to our, or let's say phosphorus or BOD or some wastewater parameter, adding to our systems, our stream systems, our waterways. And if we're at that limit, we just can't build any new wastewater discharges. We kind of have to stop it or force our treatment to be better in some way. So it's a real problem when developments happen and just put a bunch of these in there, and they're like decentralized pollution going everywhere and causing it's like a regional load going in that we don't normally regulate in the same manner. So that's a challenge that Louisiana is currently struggling with. How do we adapt and meet these TMDLs as they're getting tighter to improve our water quality? We have to, but how do we go and, do we need to update every single home here, or what's the deal? How are we going to do that? So kind of a challenge there right now. Another aspect of this particular study that Eben's working on with me, and this is also a project with Dr. Bivens and his graduate student, is really tracking to see on the bacteria side of this, or the pathogen side of this, how much of these organisms are being transported to local riverways. So the Natalbany and the Yellowwater River, both study sites there. Okay, so how about wetlands? In some way, as we think about a surface discharge with one of these aerated tanks, we could just send that to some sort of wetland, or that's kind of what we're doing if we are sending it into a ditch or something, right? It's almost an artificial wetland by design, or not by design, but just by function. So how do those work? How well do they work? Can we use them? Some important questions there. So overall, we're going to have this same type of treatment designs in mind. We want a way to take our waste and stabilize it so that it's not sucking all the oxygen out of whatever else. So it's not stinking up the place in the world. It's not such an obvious environmental hazard, like degrading our environment directly. Also, we hope to have some pathogen removal along the way. That's clearly another goal, and keeping the pathogens separated from human contact. Okay, so that's clearly what we're going to aim for. And so instead of having a system like this, the question kind of becomes, can we just simply directly send this into an engineered wetland where it's kind of constrained so that it can have the time to assimilate all those nutrients and the carbon, the oxygen demand, in a way where it's not just going to kill all the organisms, in a way that we can keep that in the same sort of area. And that, if nothing else, if we were to protect, let's say, a pond and use that pond as a treatment system and don't allow human contact with that pond, and we give a residence time of, let's say, 90 days, then there's a good chance there's not too many human pathogens remaining by the time that residence time is discharging, right? Just even giving that amount of time will reduce the pathogen load quite a bit. It's not perfect, but it would be something. So in a sense, wetlands could do that for us, as long as we know to, not go digging around in the wetlands and eating the frogs we find there or whatever, which, there's, again, an important educational component there. If you are going to use wetlands for treatment, and then kids might go play, what are they getting into, right? Okay, so as we think about how to design a wetland, we've got two options. One would be free water surface flow, so FWS is what we'll call it. And the second would be a subsurface flow. And really, these could be engineered or natural. I guess the free water surface flow would be a little more directly natural. Perhaps you can find a natural system that would kind of have some gravel and stuff you could discharge in a way that it would mostly be subsurface. But I think that generally the second would be mostly engineered, the subsurface flow. So you can use natural wetlands. Again, you have to keep it in mind, like what your design priorities here are to keep people out of it, or reduce that human contact with the pathogens. Some other considerations, of course, the flow demands. Are you just going to flood out this area by sending so much flow rate? I think the flow rates we were looking at before, you'd have to have a lot of land area to use as a wetland in order to handle big flows, right? Perhaps a small area is fine for low flows, and maybe this is a good option for things like a gray water. If you're going to divert and have black water go to a latrine or some system like that, and if you need to divert your gray water, maybe that's a good option for some kind of a wetland. Okay, pollutant capacity. How much oxygen demanding substances can this thing handle? Can the plants deal with? How flexible are your plants in the system, and is the system in total to climate variability? A system that works in Louisiana may well not work in Michigan, right? And one that works here might not work in Nicaragua once the dry season hits and the temperatures go up, or maybe when it's the wet season and things just get too flooded. How capable is the system for handling that kind of stuff? Flooding is probably a bad example because we are intentionally flooding to a large extent. But maybe if there's standing flood water too high, that could be a problem. Okay, then your treatment requirements, and also making sure, just like the other systems, that your hydrology, you're not connecting to a drinking water supply, right? That's kind of any human waste disposal. That's a major question and challenge. So that's common to all of these. So there's a few biochemical reactions that are identified as particularly helpful or common for artificial wetlands. So we would have chemoautotrophs here. We're going to take some organic carbon and oxygen, create CO2 and water, and some other stuff. So that's our typical respiration process. That's going to be all these bacteria in the soil, possibly also that would describe the plant matter taking stuff up. Then we're going to have some, another reaction we could describe here would be ammonia and bicarbonate here, plus oxygen yielding nitrate and CO2. So we could have another way to convert something. So ammonia is a good example of something that's kind of toxic. That's a sort of bioavailable but toxic form of nitrogen, and converting that to nitrate, which is slightly less available, less toxic, doing that oxidation process. So this is oxygen demand, right? So both of these cases, what we're seeing is we're taking care of oxygen demand through the biology that's going to be happening in the wetland system. That's kind of the deal here. Okay, then we could describe it a little further. Sometimes we might get full nitrogen removal, so denitrification to N2 gas. That could also be a function of a wetland system like that. Okay, so let's take a look at these FWS, the free water surface. This just means we're flowing over the surface kind of freely, and we'll design it in some way where we have the appropriate types of environments for things to go well, to keep enough dissolved oxygen in the water and all of that. So in this type of system, we will typically have some low dissolved oxygen zones. So here we describe a zone 1. If our inlet is coming right here, we'll go through a zone here with a bunch of plants there that can handle low dissolved oxygen. And if you think about, we don't have to look too far here to find some swampy territory. Some plants are okay growing in a swampy territory where there's so much organics just naturally, all the sediment here in Louisiana. There's going to be low dissolved oxygen, especially in the heat of the summer, lots of biological activity, all that. So there are plants that can handle that. And we'll look at several species. From there, you might have a second zone where you have just open water. Maybe there's some submerged plants, algae, whatever else growing. Ideally, this has enough oxygen in it, given sunlight and algae action. It's going to produce a lot of oxygen. Algae are going to be happily growing with all these nutrients. So have a zone like that where you could even support fish or other aquatic life, right? So ideally, you have a system where you are able to have enough time for the water to be here, to go through these processes, to be oxygenated in this case, to support natural life for the most part. That's the design goal here, right? Is to have natural organisms living, thriving, making use of all these nutrients while keeping this kind of in a contained space where we're avoiding human contact. And then probably another zone, also fully vegetated, where it's kind of a second filtration of sorts before your outlet. So something like that would be one of these free water surface systems. Now, for the plant matter, of course, you want good sunlight across all of it, especially for the production of your dissolved oxygen by algae. In the beds, you want something that's kind of something like a sandy loam type soil, so that water can move fairly freely through it. There's not really a big barrier for the roots to get into it, and you're not just having a bunch of like fine sediment everywhere and clogging everything up. And you want decent water movement to flush through the soil here. That way you're making good use of your surface area, all that space for bacteria to grow and do all that. Okay, so a subsurface flow. These are sometimes also called reed beds, and I've got photos from one that I got a chance to tour in France a few years ago. So we'll take a look at some of that. These are typically, you essentially use something like gravel and allow the roots to grow down into that, and then you're flowing essentially under the surface the whole time. If you were to like take a cross section, put in like, I don't know, a plexiglass thing, cut straight through the thing, you'll see it's kind of like water just flowing through. But we call it subsurface because at the surface where the plants are growing, water is not overtopping that place the whole time. So if we take a look at the plants here, we see the water level is above kind of their connection to the soil right here. So some plants can handle that just fine and they're happy. Some plants, if you flood the base right above their roots, they're not going to be so happy. I mean, a lot of plants will just be unhappy if you flood them in general. Cypress trees, you'll see all the cypress knees coming up because that's their way of dealing with it, to get some oxygen from the air where they didn't have enough in the root systems to keep all that happy. I had a reminder of that just the other day. I was spending time with my sister while she was in town and her family, and I stubbed my toe on a cypress knee, and it was like they were renting an Airbnb in this little house, and we were trying to get the grill to work, and it was kind of just like you didn't expect it because there's trees outside, but there's a little fenced-in area, but the cypress trees had like sent their roots around, and there's a about that tall thing, and it's like, ouch. So my toe is recovering well, but just reminded of their little knees everywhere. There wasn't even a swamp there. Okay. Anyway, so the gravel gives pretty good surface area, not as much as like all the sand grains, but good surface area for microbial action. But it's also importantly letting the roots go into there without really getting them, giving the roots a chance to be as flooded as they need to be. So, and these systems, you'll see the media surface up here compared to the water level. So you get aeration there, and sometimes you might even fluctuate the how much water is in these. So you could divert the flow from one bed to the next things like that, and allow some natural aeration to happen in that sense. Probably not necessary in all circumstances, but okay, so let's take a look at the scheme here then. So maybe you have half a meter of water, and that's just a little bit under the gravel surface. So you'd have water flowing maybe in this direction, have some inlet here, you have some treatment zones just kind of flowing for a little while, and you see there's a bit of a gradient here to cause it to flow in that direction. You've got maybe 30% of the length kind of is that gradient zone there, zone 1. Zone 2, kind of the rest of it pretty much. And you're treating, and in the inlet and the outlet, you can see they drew kind of larger gravel here in both cases, just to kind of protect the inlet and the outlet, make sure everything's flowing nicely, with a little bit of a finer gravel for the other parts. And then all the plants, of course, will be growing from here, and the roots will be coming down like this. So that's the a typical setup for a subsurface flow. So you've got the plants themselves benefiting from the nutrients as much as they can extract from the water. They'll be drawing out the nitrogen, the phosphorus, things like that. Lots of space for contact between, in this gravel media, you can expect oxygen transfer to be decent because these are chunks of gravel. So it should be some aeration just simply by exposure, especially if we end up draining it. That's going to pull a lot of air into the gravel. So that'll be kind of a natural suction motion pulling air in. Yeah, so you'll have a fair bit of treatment. Some of that might go anoxic down towards the bottom, but the system, that's not a terrible problem. And if you give it enough time, that's probably solved naturally there. Okay, so I mentioned I got a chance to visit, and the spot is right around this area, Montpellier. It's a pretty neat spot, and they had a system there where they were taking wastewater from a community of, I don't remember exactly, it was something like 500 to 1,000 homes. So large neighborhood type of system or small community system, handling wastewater from it. And so I have a few pictures from that, and we also have an engineered wetland system, or I guess a wetland treatment system near Mandeville we'll talk about as well. So I have a couple kind of aerial shots of that also. So here, the influent to this wetland system, we first have some sort of a screen chamber bar rack system to take out like the large particles, large scraps of things that were flushed. And so it's kind of a bit of an automated system, and you see it filling up this trash bin here with junk that's caught in the wastewater, so it doesn't enter into the wetland system. Okay, so here's kind of what it looks like. This is in the winter, so it's December, so the plants are not growing super happy at the moment, but the gravel and everything is still operating. So it's a bit dormant in some ways, and I would assume that will affect the effluent quality, but at least the bacteria will still be going. So essentially what you see here is kind of this middle area. This is sort of a pathway between the reed beds, and you'll see, reed bed here, and you see it's lined with the plastic, and then another reed bed right over here, and then there's 2 on this side as well. So we've got 4 reed beds there, kind of compartmented that way. It's a little high contrast here, but you can just see the reeds are growing kind of eye level, but this was probably a little taller than that because this was down a couple feet. We see these PVC pipes kind of inserted down into the middle, and I think these are simply vents. So they just allow extra transport of air to go in, and you'll see them in a fair number of spots. You'll also see, if you look close, there's a sprinkler system here, so they can spray the water over over this as needed over the reed beds. That's another way they can get some aeration there. I think this might also be at the influent for the system right after that collection thing. Now, one of the neat things they were experimenting with in this particular spot was several different treatment, like a post-treatment, I guess tertiary treatment options to take the water from the wetland before they're going to discharge it and do some sort of maybe disinfection, maybe filtration, advanced oxidation to see what techniques were going to become suitable for different practices. They had some experimental situations of, okay, once we, let's say, I don't know, chlorinate it or whatever, can we then grow lettuce on it? And how many pathogens will be in that lettuce, right? So they're not feeding anybody this lettuce. They're doing kind of some studies to kind of determine some of that. So that was a pretty neat operation. That's what's happening here. Again, it's winter, so it's not so exciting, but you can kind of see they have all the things hooked up. They have experimental treatment stuff right here. Most of the wetland, so all of the actual wetlands you can kind of see on the left side here. They're right here, and over here there's 4 of them, so kind of over in that direction. So then normally the effluent, I think, just discharges into a creek, there or something like that. But they're taking some of it, treating it special, and doing these experiments. So that was pretty neat. This is my former grad student, Madhu, and you probably recognize, if you came to Nicaragua, this is Geoffroy, so a few years ago. And we'll see, I think this up here is a large membrane rack, if I'm not mistaken. It's a little control panel, and I think this was for an electrolysis system. So they had several different applications there. Okay, so another wetland system. I don't know why the slide's formatted funny. There's a treatment plant in Mandeville, Louisiana. It's permitted to go up to 4 million gallons per day. The typical, though, is 2.3. I'll note that I've learned from conversations with a local wastewater operator, Ronnie Carter, that this system was designed rather poorly from the start. So it was designed to fail in the first place because there was issues and probably some unfortunate, who gets to design this or gets the bid on it or something. I don't know if it's corruption or incompetence, both, probably both. The plant itself is designed to fail. It can't treat what it needs to treat. So the idea was to use 3 stabilization lagoons, UV dosing, all this stuff, and then send it through 1,700 acres of wetland that then discharges into Lake Pontchartrain. So it'd be like a natural assimilation system. And there's a series of outfalls. It kind of discharges over a long stretch of this wetlands, and then that water will just flow to Lake Pontchartrain from there. So it's perhaps a neat concept if it was capable of meeting the design in the first place. So what has happened, so here's the picture of the actual system. So we can see from just this aerial shot what I believe to be happening is we have these little white spots. Those are probably aerators, so probably fountain aerators, so aerating the system here. So we've got some aeration in two lagoons here and part of a third, and maybe they're intentionally going for an anoxic portion. Sometimes you'll have anoxic first and then aerated. Sometimes you'll do it backwards, but then up the aeration again. I think this is probably flowing this way, and then disinfection here, kept here for a little while, and then discharged. I think that's something like that's going on. Maybe this side's also in use. I don't actually know for sure. But something approximately like that. You get some treatment, get some zones of treatment, get some aeration, and then discharging. So here's a map to kind of orient you a little bit. in this little area is where the discharge is, and we can see the wastewater treatment plant here, and then the discharge itself would be occurring kind of like over a lengthy discharge like that. And so then essentially the water's flowing kind of along the stream channel and out, something approximately like that. So this system hopefully could assimilate all that and take all that and help process it naturally. But apparently the ecology has been completely transformed by this discharge. Not too surprising. The plants that they were intending to grow, I think, were not up to the task with the type of waste issues there were. So I think there's things growing, but it's a local sore spot for anybody in the know, as I understand it. It's not really designed to do what it needs to do, and that's then presumably a pretty big contamination nutrient load to Lake Pontchartrain. So not ideal. Okay, a couple other things to mention here. I briefly mentioned this, but typically if we're going to design an artificial wetland, again, we want to keep it separate from, groundwater, anything like that might be useful. Of course, if we're doing this in a developing context, that's, perhaps a wetland unlined is still better than at least open defecation or something like that, right? So maybe this is an improvement, but ideally we'd line it. And, there's some typical specifications for what kind of lining you might use. We can see that lining was here. And you need something to protect that liner from the rocks. The gravel could scratch it up pretty easily. So if you don't have a thick enough lining, maybe you can do some sand over the rocky areas, and you be careful with it. Basically, this is all to keep your wastewater where you think that your wastewater is. Make sure it all gets treated the way you want it to be treated, and all of that. Okay, our book gives us a few comparisons here. Not going to read exactly everything, but one thing we'll note is some of the criteria they're looking at would be things like wastewater exposure. So we have on the left column here, this is the free water surface, and on the right, the subsurface flow. So this would FWS, SSF. Okay, so wastewater exposure, and they kind of go into, the surface water, that's going to allow mosquitoes, that's a public health concern. If you get mosquito fish growing, maybe that keeps it at bay. So if you keep your system operating well and it's doing fine, maybe that's all right. But the subsurface flow is a little bit more advantageous in that sense, because no one's ever really directly exposing. Mosquitoes even are going to have a hard time laying their eggs in there. Maybe it would happen or something, but there's little chance of it. So you're not getting so many birds. People obviously can't. So some differences there. We can look at the hydraulics, the bedding material and the costs there. What does the effluent look like, and how's that working? Then how big do you need it, right? So the dimensions for an FWS system recommended, we have some aspect ratio length to width of 5:1 to 10:1, and depth can be anywhere from over 6 centimeters in the vegetation to about a meter or so in the open zones. The typical size or dimensions for the subsurface would be a bit different. So it could be a square, kind of like we saw in that example from France, or it could be something that's, maybe a 0.25 to 1, something like that. And then you're going to want the gravel to be anywhere from about 1/3 of a meter to a little more than a meter. Or no, excuse me, that's less than a meter. Maybe like 1/3 to 2/3 of a meter. So a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, somewhere in that range in terms of depth that you need there. Okay, so there's some more details there, but that's kind of a big picture considerations. And of course, if you are going to design something like this in a developing context, you might start thinking, okay, well, do we have access to local gravel or something equivalent? Do we have a way to establish this with local materials? Is it okay if we don't line it? Is it okay if we use this area? Can we section it off so that nobody's trying to grow spinach here or something? Who knows what's going to happen there. So just that educational aspect. Oh, what can we expect for a well-designed wetland system? Well, we can expect some pathogen removal, maybe 1 to 2 logs. There's still going to be pathogens there, so it's a concern, but that's helpful. Again, that's sort of that natural assimilation, competition, natural decay of the pathogens over that time. We'll get rid of some nutrients, some total suspended solids, and some oxygen demand. And so we can take a look. We've got data for typical ones, the FWS here, subsurface flow here. So for these observations, we can see the influent on the left column and the effluent on the right column. So we went from 170 to 12 in terms of BOD on this particular example. That's great, right? That's a significant reduction. And when we're anywhere kind of close to the amount of oxygen saturation, there's a good chance whatever stream or something can handle that, especially if it's not 100% the wastewater, right? So if we're like 100 BOD, we're probably in trouble. If we're not so close to that, we're probably doing all right. So the subsurface flow had a similar change, and we can look at the percentages. But overall, we can see, we're getting pretty good ammonia removal from 32 to 3.8 or 48 to 2.9. These are different systems entirely, but we're seeing each of these is showing some pretty good removal. Okay, so in terms of the types of plants we can use, some of these might be familiar, or you might be kind of curious and go take a look. We mentioned this, but the types of plants that can be used for the different systems really depends on the physiology of the plants, right? So maybe cypress trees could be used if we were to design a system right. That would probably be the free water surface one, because I doubt they would like to grow into gravel, and that probably kill the system anyway. I don't know. But you can imagine certain things, and usually we're going to use smaller plants, bushes and things. So we have bulrush, cattail, common arrowhead, papyrus, all good and happy for the free water system, free water surface. And then the ones that would rather the gravel type approach and to dip their roots in but not be completely submerged would be tornado grass, the common reed, rush, sedge, yellow flag. I've not heard of several of these, umbrella palm, wild cane. So fair number, and this is, I'm sure, not exhaustive, but you can kind of get an idea, if I want this type of a system, I need to make sure I can get this type of a plant. And that could be something you look into your local area, right? If we are going to design something in Nicaragua, for example, can we find something that grows in the wetter regions in this approximate climate that could handle being partially submerged or fully submerged year-round, right? Our design would be, we're flowing wastewater through it, and we're expecting that wastewater to continue. So if we have the open water surface system, well, we need to find something that can grow in this general climate, assuming that it's flooded constantly. Okay, so that's all I've got for you today. I think next time, actually not sure what we're talking about next time, but I'll figure that out. Good luck on your wrapping up the senior design presentations and all that.